And once you've marked your songbooks at 684, I want you to consider just very briefly a couple things from this morning's scripture reading before we get into today's lesson. The reading from 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 11. Peter reminds us he's using logic here. After he talks about the destruction of the earth that we live in, he says, since all these things are to be dissolved, what sort of people ought you to be in lives of holiness and godliness? So he's asking a rhetorical question. The question really has no necessary answer. The answer is very clear. If everything in this world is to be destroyed and brought to nothing, then what is it that really matters? What matters is our godliness, our holiness. That is what matters for eternity. And he also says in verse 14, therefore, beloved, since you are witnessing for these things, be diligent. Be diligent to be found by him, by God, without spot or blemish, and at peace. And at peace. I'll leave you with those thoughts as we continue our study with the kings of Israel this morning. Last week we began to look at Solomon. Solomon, as we noted last week, is the second child born to King David by his wife Bathsheba. If you remember Bathsheba, after David's adulterous relationship with Bathsheba, he had her first husband, Uriah, a Hittite, killed. And so Solomon is their second child. The first child, of course, died in a way of punishment because of their sin, or specifically because of David's sin. And so also in last week we studied about David's third oldest son. Adonijah is the way I pronounced his name. I don't know if that's an accurate pronunciation or not. But we saw how he attempted to elevate himself, to set himself up as king. But David had chosen to follow God's commandment to make Solomon a son after him. And so God had told David, Solomon's going to reign as king. He is going to build the temple. He is going to be the leader of the people. And so David, in last week's study, set Solomon up as king, much to Adonijah's disappointment and fear. He emphasized that. Now, Adonijah had several leaders who were with David, who stood with Adonijah. And we saw that last week. This week, I just want to very briefly cite the sad ending to those who supported Adonijah and Adonijah himself. Adonijah was killed for an improper request. Some Bible scholars look at that. Well, was it an improper request, or was it an improper way to make the request? I don't know. You can read it for yourself, formulate your opinion. I don't know as it matters, but Adonijah was killed for inappropriate request, or an inappropriate way of making a request in 1 Kings chapter 2. I'm not going to go back there for time's sake, but just to paraphrase, he desired a woman in the king's house to become his wife. And instead of going to his brother, Solomon, he made the request through Solomon's mother, Bathsheba. And ultimately, King Solomon did not approve of the request or the way it was made. The Bible's not really clear on that. And so Adonijah lost his life because of that. Also, a supporter of Adonijah who rejected Solomon was Abiathar. He was a priest, a Levitical priest, and he did care for and carry the Ark of the Covenant. But Abiathar had chosen to support Adonijah in his desire to become king. and he was allowed to live. Solomon says in 1 Kings chapter 2 and in verse 26 through 27, Abiathar the priest, and to Abiathar the priest the king said, "Go to Anathoth to your estate, for you deserve death. But I will not at this time put you to death." You think about Abiathar here. He's a priest of God. He knew well that God had said Solomon will be king. Abiathar made a decision to go against the will of God and against King David. He says, "You deserve death. Because you carried the ark of the Lord before David my father, and because you shared in all my father's afflictions." So Solomon expelled Abiathar from being priest to the Lord, thus fulfilling the word of the Lord that he had spoken concerning the house of Eli in Shiloh. So again, this is an expulsion, but he didn't kill him. Okay. Next is Joab. You'll remember Joab. Last week we studied. Joab's a cousin of David, and or I believe a cousin of David. Actually, I believe he's David's nephew. I'm sorry, David's nephew, son of an older brother. Joab had been with David. He had been David's commander-in-chief of the army, head of the Israelite army for many, many years, for all of David's real life. But Joab aligned himself with Abiathar, and Joab finally answers for a murder that David did not hold him accountable for. Joab murdered. There's 3 people listed. We'll go back here to verse 28. And just very quickly skim over this list of people. It says, when the news came to Joab, for Joab had supported Adonijah, although he had not supported Absalom, Joab fled to the tent of the Lord and caught hold of the horns of the altar. Now, skip down with me, if you will, down in here about verse, let's look at verse 32. This is what Solomon says. The Lord will bring back his bloody deeds on his own head. Because without knowledge of my father David, he attacked and killed with the sword 2 men more righteous and better than himself. Abner, the son of Ner, commander of the army of Israel. So he is guilty of the murder of Abner. And again, I didn't take time to look up the reference to find that location, but you can find that in 2 Chronicles, pretty short. Commander of the army of Israel, and Amasa, the son of Jether, commander of the army of Judah. So Joab had killed both of these. So shall their blood come back on the head of Joab, and on the head of his descendants forever. But for David and for his descendants, and his house and for his throne, there shall be peace from the Lord forevermore. So let's just move on. Shimei. Shimei is a relative of King Saul's who cursed David to his face and then later repented. But at the end of last week's study, we noticed that David basically told Solomon, do not trust Shimei. And Shimei is, to me, the most interesting of all. Solomon does not go out to kill Shimei. He gives him, I guess you might say, a house arrest order that Shimei agrees to. And in verse 36, if we drop down there, the king sent and summoned Shimei and said to him, build yourself a house in Jerusalem and dwell there, and do not go out from there to any place whatever. Okay, so there's the commandment. For on the day you go out and cross the brook Kidron, know for certain that you shall die. Your blood shall be on your own head. And Shimei said to the king, what you say is good. As my lord the king has said, so will your servant do. So Shimei lived in Jerusalem many days. Now, Shimei is an old man. He is quite advanced in years, but he had, of course, turned traitor on David, cursed him to his face. They later made up, and Shimei was allowed to live. And then Shimei joined himself to Adonijah in chapter 1 of the book of Kings, and so this was his punishment. Notice verse 39, though. But it happened at the end of 3 years that two of Shimei's servants ran away to Achish, the son of Micah, king of Gath. Okay, this is Philistine land. Gath. Micah is a province of Philistines. And when it was told Shimei, behold, your servants are in Gath, Shimei rose, saddled a donkey, and went to Gath, to Achish, to seek his servants. Shimei went and brought his servants from Gath. And when Solomon was told that Shimei had gone from Jerusalem to Gath and returned, the king sent and summoned Shimei and said to him, did I not make you swear by the Lord and solemnly warn you, saying, know for certain that on the day you go out and go to any place whatever, you shall die. And you said to me, what you say is good, I will obey. Why then have you not kept your oath to the Lord and to the commandment with which I commanded you? So I think this is interesting here. He gives him a commandment. He breaks a promise. Now, what good is a commandment or a law if it's not held up? It's nothing but paper and ink, or in this case, a verbal commandment. You know, sometimes politicians make a lot of vain threats. And it's nothing more than that, vain threats. You know, man is only as good as his word. So here's Solomon. He's given a commandment. He's given his word as king of Israel. And Shimei has agreed to that word. Notice what happens, verse 43. Why then have you not kept the oath to the Lord and to the commandment which I commanded you? The king also said to Shimei, you know in your heart all the harm that you did to David my father. So the Lord will bring back your harm to your own head. But King Solomon shall be blessed, and the throne of David shall be established before the Lord forever. Then the king commanded Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, and he went and struck him down, and he died. So the kingdom was established in the hand of Solomon. So kind of a not great start to his kingdom, but I want you to notice it's a bit rocky, it's a bit rough. But Solomon has some early achievements that are noteworthy. Over in chapter 3, Solomon made a marriage alliance with Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. He took Pharaoh's daughter and brought her to the city of David until he had finished building his own house and the house of the Lord and a wall around Jerusalem. I'm going to pause there for a minute. You notice Solomon builds his own house. He builds the house of the Lord. He also builds a wall around Jerusalem. Those are all great accomplishments. Those are all things that he was very, very well known for. The wall around Jerusalem would bring about a security for the people. But I also want you to notice here we see one of Solomon's weaknesses. It's a weakness that we saw in David. It's a potential, if you will, character flaw. Solomon marries the daughter of Pharaoh of Egypt, which of course was forbidden under Jewish law, under the Mosaic commandments, they were not to marry someone outside of their own country, outside of their own faith, outside of the brotherhood. And so Solomon does this. I believe it's a character flaw, and I think that we will see demonstrated through the life of Solomon as we study his life. This is his one fault. His one weakness is what his father David's weakness was, and that was a weakness after the fair sex. Now, it is noted here, if we read a little bit farther, the people were sacrificing at high places, however, because no house had yet been built for the name of the Lord. Notice verse 3. Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of David his father. Only he sacrificed and made offerings at the high places. And the king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there for what was a great high place. Solomon used to offer 1,000 burnt offerings on the altar. So I want you to think about this. Could it be said of us that we love the Lord? I hope that it could be said that we love the Lord, because it said of Solomon that he loved the Lord. It also says that Solomon walking in the statutes of David his father. Could it be said that we walk in the ways of those who have gone before, who loved the Lord? David, after all, was a man after God's own heart. What better person for Solomon to fashion himself after than his father David? You know, in Proverbs chapter 1, Solomon writes this as an older man. In Proverbs chapter 1, verse 7, if you'll begin there with me, Solomon says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. Hear, my son, your father's instruction, and forsake not your mother's teaching. For they are graceful garlands for your head and pendants for your neck. My son, if sinners entice you, do not consent. If they say, come with us, let us lie and wait for blood. Let us ambush the innocent without reason. Like Sheol, let us swallow them alive, and whole like those who go down to the pit." You know, Solomon says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. I want you to notice that. Prior to all of this, Solomon's just another man. I'll grant you a man with a good heart, a man who, it says, loved the Lord. But notice, I'm going to read down through here a little bit further. I want you to notice a few things as we read down through here. What happens to Solomon? Begin in verse 5, if you will. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, Ask what I shall give you. And Solomon said, You have shown great and steadfast love to your servant, my David, my father, because he walked before you in faithfulness, in righteousness, and in righteousness of heart towards you. You have kept for him this great and steadfast love, and have given him a son to sit on his throne this day. And now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of David my father. Although I am but a little child, I do not know how to go out or come in, and your servant is in the midst of the people whom you have chosen, a great people, too many to be numbered or counted for multitude. Give your servant therefore an understanding mind to govern your people, that I may discern between good and evil. For who is able to govern your great people? It pleased the Lord that Solomon asked this, and God said to him, Because you have asked this and have not asked for yourself long life or riches, or the life of your enemies, but because you have asked for yourself understanding and to discern what is right, behold, I now do according to your word. Behold, I give you a wise and discerning mind, so that none like you has been before you, and none like you shall arise after you. I give you also what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that no other king shall compare with you all your days. And if you walk in my ways and keep my statutes and my commandments, as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your days. Now I want you to notice, what would I ask for? What would you ask for? You know, I go to God in prayer quite frequently. A lot of times my prayers, you know, sometimes they tend to be wish lists. You know, I've prayed, and I don't know if the Lord is just not hearing my prayer or not, but I prayed for a song leader for this congregation because I can't carry a tune in a bucket. And so I feel like that's something we really need. But, you know, God hasn't answered that prayer yet. So, you know, the question is, when we approach God, what do we ask for? What do we ask God for? Do we ask God for things that will benefit us? Yes, we do, and I dare say all of us do. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. But what did Solomon ask for? Solomon asked God for wisdom, not for himself. Solomon didn't ask God, Lord, help me to be wise so that I might make the right decisions, so that I might be a wealthy king or a powerful nation. No. Solomon did not ask for himself, but so that he could be a good king for the people of God. I want you to notice that. Solomon's desire was to be a good king for the people of God. He says here, and Solomon said, verse 6, you have shown steadfast love to your servant David my father, because he walked before you in faithfulness and righteousness and in uprightness of heart towards you. Now drop down a little bit. He says in verse 7, and now, O Lord God, you have made your servant king in place of David my father, although I am but a little child. So he recognized his youth. Now he doesn't mean necessarily a little child. He is an adult, but he is young. I do not know how to go out or come in. In other words, he feels insecurity in his decisions. He doesn't have the wisdom of a man the age of his father. And your servant is in the midst of your people. Notice this. He says, I am in the midst of your people, God, whom you have chosen. And then he extols the number. Too many to be numbered or counted, for multitude. And his request is found in verse 9. Give your servant, therefore, an understanding mind to govern your people. It wasn't a request for him. It was a request for God's people. It was a request that he might be a just king over the people of God, that I may discern between good and evil, for who is able to govern this great people. It's a very humble request. Solomon demonstrates a great amount of humility here. A humble request. How many times do I pray really a selfish prayer to God? I want you to notice God's response in verse 9 and 10. It pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this. This is pleasing to God. God is glad that Solomon didn't ask for himself. He says, because you have not asked this, and have not asked for yourself. And God lists things that Solomon might have asked for. A long life, riches, you know, the destruction of your enemies. But he asked it because of the people. You'll notice there are conditions to God's blessing. God says, I'm going to give you all these extra things. I'm going to give you long life. He says, I'm going to give you the hand of your enemy. I'm going to give you riches and honor. But But there's a condition found in verse 14. If you walk in my ways and keep my statutes and my commandments, as your father David. Solomon already noted his father kept God's commandments. So he said, got to do this. Verse 15, and Solomon awoke, and behold, it was a dream. Then he came to Jerusalem and stood before the ark of the covenant of the Lord and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings and made a feast for all his servants. Solomon receives a gift. This might have been a dream. And it might have simply been that, except for one thing. We know that God granted Solomon his request. The fascinating thing about Solomon, and I think the reason that the real reason I like Solomon even more than his father David is the two books that Solomon penned, the book of Proverbs, the book of Ecclesiastes. He also penned the book, the Song of Solomon, so we don't want to discount that. But the two books that I love the most in the Old Testament are Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, because what they do is they impart a little bit of Solomon's knowledge to us. And they are fascinating books. I think of all, my favorite is probably Ecclesiastes. We were out in Missouri visiting folks out there, and one of the fellows made a comment one time, and I've heard someone else make the comment, Ecclesiastes is just a depressing book. And I'm like, huh? That every time someone says Ecclesiastes is a depressing book, and the reason they say it's a depressing book is that Solomon is an old man. This is the last book he wrote. He's an old man, and he's looking back on the facts of life. And to a point, Solomon laments how much time and energy he has wasted on women, wealth, and fame. Hey, he says all of that doesn't matter. At the conclusion of the book of Ecclesiastes, he says, fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. Or the English Standard Version, I think says, the whole purpose of man. At Solomon's conclusion, everything else doesn't matter. We enjoy it. In fact, he says to enjoy it. He says to enjoy your labor. Enjoy what wealth you might accumulate. Enjoy your life, but don't let it consume you. And that demonstrates the wisdom of Solomon. Here's the thing. Solomon asked for wisdom. What good is it for us to ask something from God if we don't use it? What good is anything God gives us if we don't use it? I want you to notice with me, I'm going to read the last section of this chapter as we look at Solomon. This is the first opportunity that Solomon has to use wisdom. And it gains him. Solomon was already a very popular king. I mean, the people, there was Solomon all the way. Other than that handful of people that stuck with Adonijah, the people of Israel were just with Solomon all the way. He had their favor. But here, as God gives him wisdom, this just mounts his popularity as king something drastic. So notice verse 16. Then two prostitutes came to Solomon. Well, there's the first problem. But anyway, we won't go there. And stood before him. One woman said, "Oh, my Lord, this woman and I live in the same house. And I gave birth to a child while she was in the house. Then on the third day after I gave birth, this woman also gave birth. And we were alone. There was no one else with us in the house. Only we two were in the house. And this woman's son died in the night because she lay on him. And she arose at midnight and took my son from beside me while your servant slept, and laid with him at her breast, and laid her dead son at my breast. While I arose in the morning to nurse my child, behold, he was dead. But when I looked at him closely in the morning, behold, he was not the child that I had borne. But the other woman said, No, the living child is mine, and the dead child is yours. The first said, No, the dead child is yours, and the living child is mine. Thus they spoke before the king. There's an argument here. Both of them want the child that's alive. During this period of time, the king acted as a judge over the people. How would you know? How would you discern? Solomon uses the wisdom he's gotten from God. Verse 23. Then the king said, the one says, This is my son that is alive, and your son is dead. The other says, No, but your son is dead, and my son is the living one. And the king said, Bring me a sword. So a sword was brought before the king. And the king said, Divide the child in two, and give half to one and half to the other. Then the woman whose son was alive said to the king, because her heart yearned for her son, O my lord, give her the living child, and by no means put him to death. But the other said, He shall be neither mine nor yours. Divide him. Then the king answered and said, Give the living child to the first woman, and by no means put him to death. She is his mother. And all Israel heard the judgment that the king had rendered, and they stood in awe of the king, because they perceived that the wisdom of God was in him to do justice. Wow. That story has fascinated me for years. In that Solomon had the wisdom to do that. And, looking back on it, because we're familiar with that story, it may not seem like much. But can you see this going down in Judge Judy's court or something like that? Cut the kid in half and we'll figure this out. It'll be fair that way. Even worldly people respect someone who does the right thing. That's what Solomon was after the whole time, was justice. Solomon wasn't after peace necessarily. He was after justice. Whose child did it belong to? Who was the rightful parent and who was wrong? What good is wisdom if it serves no purpose? Our closing thought today. I know we were late starting this morning, and so the lesson is hopefully within our time frame. Micah chapter 6 and verse 8. If you'll turn back there and read the entire passage. Micah 6 and verse 8. What doth the Lord require of thee? Is the way the King James Version renders that. In Micah chapter 6 and verse 8, He has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. I think that's exactly what Solomon is going to do. We're going to see it demonstrated. I do not intend to spend as long on Solomon's life as I did on David's life. The Bible does not have as much to say about Solomon, even though it talks about his wisdom and his justice. But I believe at the end we will see, even though Solomon is human, he makes mistakes, and I think we've seen his character flaws demonstrated right here in the first chapter of his life, second chapter, I guess, of his kingdom. But I think that Solomon demonstrates what the Lord requires of anyone. It's very simple. To do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with our God. there's anyone here this morning who's subject to the invitation of the Lord, I would encourage you to think on those things and ask yourself how your walk with God is going. As together we open our songbooks to 684.